Typically, we develop a JAMStack application using VS Code and then deploy it to something like Azure Static Web Apps. But this isn't our only option. Let's go and see what Visual Studio 2022 can do for a JAMStack developer. So the first thing we want to do is start from scratch and create ourselves a new directory. And then we want to create our Nuxt application in our case, but this could be any single page application. So it could be a React site or whatever you want to use for your SPA front end. So let's create a new Nuxt app called Frontend. And let's install all the packages. So that's all our packages installed. So now we can jump over to Visual Studio 2022 and let's create a new file. And let's just create a text file for now. But this is our new project file. Let's save this file in the right place. And we need to change that to all files and in our Nuxt 3 front end. And we're going to call this frontend.esproj. And then I am going to paste in what we need. So we're using the JavaScript SDK, and I've cribbed this from somewhere else. So what you can do is, if you want to do this from scratch, you can create a new project. And if you come over to the templates and type in Vue, eventually you'll see that there are two Vue project types. So there is a standalone Vue project, or that's a TypeScript one, or a standalone JavaScript Vue project. So you can use these templates as well to create this esproj file if you want. But essentially this is what you end up with, is an esproj file. But I've changed a few bits in here. So I've changed the startup command to what we use to start our Nuxt application, which is npm run dev. I've changed the production build command to the npm run generate that we use to generate our static pages. And I've also changed the build output folder to our .output public, which is where our build artifacts get placed when we use npm run generate. So let's save that, close that, and now let's open that as a project. We can see that this has given us our start point for our Nuxt application. We've got our app.vue in there and everything that we would expect. Now let's save everything in here, and this wants us to save our solution. So we're going to save that in the folder above the front end, because we're going to have a back end as well as part of this. And let's change the name of that to Nuxt 3 ASP.net.solution and save that. Before we go any further with this, I just need to close the solution and then jump over to the folder containing the front end and get rid of the .vs folder, which is a hidden folder, because that messes things up. And then in here, while I'm here, I'm going to create a new folder called .vs code. And then let's jump back over to Visual Studio and reopen our solution again. Switch to our folder view. We can see our VS Code folder. So let's create a new file in here called launch.json. And this is all the stuff that Visual Studio Code normally does for you. So you can copy this from another project, but essentially this is setting up that we can launch our front end in Chrome on localhost 3000, or we can launch it in Edge on localhost 3000. So let's just save that out and let's switch back to the solution view. And now let's add a new project, and let's create a ASP.NET Core Web API, and we'll call this Backend, and that is the correct location. And we'll do .NET 7. Now that that's out, we won't configure for HTTPS, we won't use Docker, we won't use controllers, we won't enable API support. And we will use top level statements, so it gives us a minimal API. So let's go and create that, and let's go to our launch settings, not app settings. Let's go and have a look at that. Let's change that to backend, and we don't want launch browser. In fact, we can just get rid of launch browser and launch URL. Let's save that out, and then just in our program.cs, let's change the route that we use for this to /API/weather forecast, because that helps us distinguish between our front end routing and our API routing that goes to our back-end API. Then on the solution, we can set the startup project, and we want multiple startup projects. And so we can change the action for the back end to start and the action for the front end to start. And I always start the back end beforehand, just so it gives it a little bit more time to warm up before the front end starts, in case you've got any code that accesses the API at startup. Let's apply that. And let's go and tweak our Nuxt application a little bit. So in our Nuxt config, let's go and add the setting that we need so that we can proxy our requests across. Whenever we get a request on /API, we proxy that across to localhost. And let's just go and check that that URL is correct. So localhost 5159 it should be. So let's just make sure that that is that. Then let's change this as well so that we can actually see the results of that API call. So we're going to make an API call in here, and we're just going to dump out the result that we get back from it, just to illustrate that it has actually been called. So let's fire this up and see what we get. There's a few windows started there. So we've got our Nuxt application as we would normally see. We've also got our ASP.NET backend running as well, as we would expect, on port 5159. And we now see our browser opened with our Nuxt application, and our API call has succeeded and called some data. So that is all working, and that's all on a single click from Visual Studio that you get all of that up and running. So that's a much better experience. And not only that, but I can come back over to Visual Studio and maybe place a breakpoint in the scripting code of the onMounted, so before I call my function. And then if I jump back over here and refresh that, you can see that that jumps straight in, and I can see all kinds of useful information. So here we can go into the globals, etc., and we can see the Nuxt object in the globals, etc., etc. So that's really handy. And not only that, but of course, if I come over to the back end and place a breakpoint, let's go there, and if I now continue that code, you see that I now break into the back end because the front end has called the API. So I'm getting C# and JavaScript debugging inside Visual Studio. So that's a really good experience and really quite powerful in terms of development experience. So let's just stop all that and let's publish this up to Azure so that we can see what that does for us as well. So there's a few changes that I need to make in order to do this, because what we're essentially going to do is publish our ASP.NET backend, and that's going to be the host for our static front end. So there's a few things that we need to do. So over in the program CS, I need to go and add some things to say that we want it to use default files and also to use static files. So that gives me essentially a root folder where the resulting SPA application can sit. Then inside the backend project, in here we just need to add an item group that references that front end project and tells it that there isn't a reference output assembly. So let's just save that and close that off. And just to test what this actually does, if I try and publish this, and for now let's publish it to a local folder, and we can accept the defaults for that. And if I now hit publish, we can see down here that this is running the npm run generate. to generate our SPA as we normally would do with Nuxt, but however you generate your static web app, you can replace that appropriately. And that's now created that. So if I go across to that particular folder, what I'd see is that I've got a backend DLL and a backend executable for the backend API, and also a www root. And if I look in there, that's where my Nuxt application, so the resulting output. So let's just step back and show what actually happened there. It created this output folder and a public folder, and that is essentially what gets copied across to the www root folder when we actually do our publish. So just to prove that point, let's run up backend.exe, and we can see that's running on localhost 5000. So let's go to that, and we can see already that that has served our application, started our Nuxt app, and already called across to our API to get the data. So there's no cause issues here because it's all being hosted on the same site. It's all trusted because we're just referencing the same site when we call our API. That's good. That shows that our publish is working, and if we publish the backend up to Azure, it will have our static front end embedded within it so that it can serve both of those things from a single application. So now let's do another publish. So let's publish to Azure. Let's pick Azure App Service for Linux. And I'm already signed in Visual Studio, and I've already provisioned an app service where I can deploy this to. And let's publish that. So that's deployed, so let's go and open the site. And we see that exactly the same as we were seeing locally. We've called across to our Nuxt website, and we're seeing our Nuxt SPA application here, and it's making a call to our backend API, all as part of the same site. So we've got no cause problems going on. It's all hosted together under the same domain, so we don't get any issues there. You might be asking, well, that's all great, but why would I care about this? Why would I want to host it this way and not on static web apps or some other means of hosting it? Well, the advantage here is that, as I've said, you are running it all on the same site under the same domain, so you avoid all the cause issues, the same as you do with static web apps. So there's no real advantage there, but you're not getting the disadvantage of hosting your API in one domain and hosting your SPA in another domain. So you then have cause issues when you try to call one from the other. The other big benefit is that your backend here is now no longer running on Azure Functions. So although it's not serverless anymore, and you lose some of the benefits of running on a serverless API, so scalability, that kind of thing, you do get the benefits of running with the full .NET Core stack. So all of those frameworks that you've been excluded from using with using Azure Functions because of the Azure Functions hosting model are now open to you again, because you're on the full .NET Core hosting model. And not only that, but the experience inside Azure for app service, as opposed to a static web app, is much richer in terms of your backend API. So the backend API is pretty much the brains of the outfit. So when things go wrong, you want to be able to see what's going on. And in static web apps, you can see here that you get nothing in terms of logging or anything available to you to actually be able to see what's going on with your Azure function. You have to get into the system terminal and all of that sort of aggravation. Whereas if we come over to the app service, all of this nice monitoring and logs and log stream available to us. So we can see here exactly what it's done in terms of starting the application up and that kind of thing. If I quickly jump back over to Visual Studio in here, and inside my API function, right before I return, if I did a console write line on what we're actually returning, and then let's go back to publish and publish this back up again. So that has succeeded. So let's jump back over to here and let's just refresh our page so that we actually get a request. And then if I come over to the log stream, I can see in the log straight away there that I get my weather forecast with what we actually returned back to the front end. So the the logging and debugging experience is that much richer on the app service because it's that much more of a mature service. So that's a major benefit for me in terms of being able to understand and log out and do things. That with the full .NET framework seems to be a major benefit for hosting it this way, and the drawbacks that you lose with not using static web apps don't seem to outweigh that for me, but your mileage may be different, so let me know what you think in the comments. And of course, you don't have to publish this way, so don't think that because you're in Visual Studio that you're now limited to this. Of course, you can obviously put this in source control and use GitHub Actions to deploy all this to your app service the same way that you normally would. So that's all I had for this video. So I want to thank you for watching, and I want to thank my sponsors of the channel, without whom the channel wouldn't be growing. So thank you very much for your contributions. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.